Hello and welcome back to my channel. I am so happy to have you here and I'm really excited to talk about this topic today. Actually, this is something that a lot of my friends and family don't know is an obsession of mine. It's something that I've been really interested in ever since I was a small child, actually. So basically, my first interest happened when I was a really little girl. I went over to my grandmother's home and she used to have this massive bookshelf full of all kinds of literature, and I picked out an encyclopedia one time and just started reading about Italy, reading about immigration, and I started specifically reading about Calabria because that was a name that I heard growing up in my family. So I wanted to know more about this. I wanted to know more about where my family came from. And that was sort of where all of this took off. And it's kind of been a wild ride ever since. It's been a bit of a hyperfixation of mine during certain periods of my life, and it's something that I'm really excited to share with you. A lot of the people that follow this channel, according to my statistics, a lot of them are Italian Americans, or at least people living within the US. So I imagine that a lot of them are Italian Americans. And a lot of the comments that I receive are also from Italian Americans or other people of Italian origin living in other countries. So although this is a language channel, and I've had the express intention to make this a language channel, I see that there's an interest in a lot of the Italian content that I have. One of the best videos that I have on this channel, at least in terms of performance, is the video that I did about Calabrian dialects. I got a lot of feedback about that, mostly positive. And so I see that there's a huge interest in this sort of topic. I'm more than happy to talk about it, trust me. This is something I really love. So we'll go with it. We'll work with it. I want to mention that I've created an Instagram page that I will link in my bio that is specifically about Italian immigration history. It has nothing to do with me on a personal level. It's purely Italian immigration history. So if you're interested in this topic, please do follow it. It's Our Italian Story on Instagram. Again, I will link it in the bio. One of the reasons I wanted to do this video specifically is because there's actually a lot of misinformation online about this. I've seen some posts like, why would our Italian ancestors leave this beautiful country? And it's like, I think that people just really don't understand what Italy looked like during the period of time that a lot of our ancestors immigrated to the Americas, right? The Italy of today that we see that, particularly in the north, is very developed and beautiful, and now there's some debate about whether or not it's clean, but I'm not going to get into that today. But the Italy that we see today that seems really developed and nice is certainly not the Italy that our ancestors immigrated from. And I want to be very clear that a lot of our ancestors came from the South. The South today is still relatively underdeveloped in comparison to the North. There are historical reasons for this that I can get into in a totally different video, but it's really important to understand the context of that time and why your ancestors decided to leave such a beautiful country, right? Now, we need to observe Italy of that time through a very historical lens. Prior to 1861, Italy was largely just, I don't even know that they would call them provinces at the time. They were basically small kingdoms or city-states. They were run primarily by small kingdoms. And this is interesting because if you go to Italy today, most places have a castle or some kind of royal palace that the royal family used to live in. This is important to understand because prior to unification of Italy in 1861, that was the way that things went. And a lot of the people, most of your ancestors, were probably peasants working for these kingdoms, okay? They didn't earn a lot of money, if any money at all. Many of them were essentially just working to survive. And so that's something that's really important to understand. I remember when I got my Italian documents from the comune in Italy that my family comes from, and it listed my ancestors as contadini, which basically means peasant, like they're peasant farmers. Now, I'm not going to get into the history of unification today. It's very long and kind of complicated, but post 1861, Italy was unified, and that essentially did away with the kingdoms at the time. Now, I'm not pro that system at all. It was a feudal system. It was very abusive and exploitative. But the transition out of that system into essentially the Italy that we have today was grueling and difficult, and there were lots of issues, including lots of economic hardship, lots of scarcity. People were quite literally starving in many cases. This, of course, led to a lot of political instability, a lot of issues with governance, organization, crime, and so on. The level of poverty and unemployment was really high. And so people were essentially promised a potentially better life elsewhere. And desperate times call for desperate measures, right? Something else that we need to take into consideration, there were several large natural disasters that happened over this period of time. So I'm referring mostly to the period of time, let's say between the 1870s and the early 1900s, so around 1920, let's say. Also, following the dissolution of these kingdoms, there were really high taxes that affected people. Obviously, this affected people's economic stability, and just with the lack of opportunities, particularly in the South, where 80% of the immigration was going to come from, this really affected people's way of life, and so that caused a massive wave of immigration. Additionally, and this is something that's important to mention, Southerners, Italian Southerners, many of which ended up moving into the northern part of Italy, they were heavily discriminated against. And again, there are historical reasons for this. Some of this is related to class, some of this is related to ethnic identity, language, and so on. Because the Americas at that time were industrializing at a really high rate, particularly the United States and Argentina, that meant that a lot of immigration was encouraged, right? We needed labor, cheap labor, and quite frankly, it was exploitation. Okay, we need to be really real about that. But basically, it promised these people a better life, better opportunity, and people kind of assumed that the roads were going to be paved in gold. They had heard stories, right? There were sort of these legends of what it was going to be like to be in the Americas, and that was the assumption, okay? So that meant that they packed up all of their belongings, they packed up their families, and they moved across the ocean. Now, in some cases, these people made this journey several times, which is crazy to think about because it took a really long time to leave their homelands. And I remember when I went to Vervicaro, this is where my family comes from in Calabria, it's a mountain town, kind of up in the middle of nowhere. And I remember going up there the first time that I went, and I was just thinking, how did they do that? How did they get down the mountain at that time, right? We're talking about like the early 1900s. How did they get down the mountain and manage to get to the port of Napoli and then make their way all the way to the U.S.? I mean, it's crazy. The amount of dedication that these people had was incredible. And I mean, in all honesty, it was a lot of desperation, right? By the 1920s, over 4 million Italians had immigrated to the U.S. This made them one of the largest immigrant populations in the United States and gave them a lot of collective power. When we're talking about Argentina and Brazil, by the early 1920s, Italian immigrants made up approximately 40% of the local population there. And in Brazil, these people were primarily working on plantations and doing really, really hard physical labor. Just within the first decade of the 1900s, approximately 2 million Italians immigrated to the U.S. during that period of time, primarily entering on the East Coast, let's say Ellis Island area, but a lot of them made their way to the West, and this is why we have pretty large pockets of Italian communities within the Bay Area of California and Southern California as well. Italians had a massive impact on culture, on the labor force. I mean, there are lots of stories. I can't wait to get into all of this stuff because honestly, some of it is really cool. Some of it's really sad, okay? And we'll get into that as well. But some of it's really cool, and of course we can see the effects of Italian contributions on our culture in the United States and, again, throughout the rest of the Americas today. They faced heinous discrimination. It was a really difficult time for a lot of Italian immigrants. There are some pretty horrific stories about what happened to Italian immigrants at that time. This was something that affected people in terms of labor, in terms of rights. There were a lot of anti-immigration policies that went into effect in the early 1900s due to the massive wave of immigration that was coming from Italy. Italians, typically speaking, were stereotyped as uneducated, brutish. I remember specifically the term cutthroat. So, you know, there was a lot of discrimination, actually a lot of fear, I think, from people regarding the immigration that was happening at the time. A lot of them worked in really dangerous, unsanitary conditions, in mines, a lot of low-paying jobs, very difficult manual labor, construction, factory work. They worked on railroads, you name it, lots of different stuff. Whenever we look at history, we have to, of course, consider the context of that time. And again, this is why I've decided to make this video, because I think that when people visit the large cities like Rome and Florence, Milan, and so on, they think like, oh, this is such a beautiful place. Why would my ancestors ever go to somewhere else? Well, go back to where your family came from. Go back to the cities where your family came from. In some cases, those places really haven't progressed that much, even within the last century. So it's important to consider the context of the history at that time and really recognize the huge differences that have gone on for a long time between the North and the South. This is, again, something that I can touch on in another video. Thank you so much. Again, if there's any particular topic regarding Italian immigration history that you would like me to talk about or research, I would love to do that. I'm more than happy to continue talking about this on this channel. It's something that I see people are interested in, and around here we give the people what they want, okay? So thank you so much for watching today. Thank you so much for sharing and subscribing and commenting and all those things. It really helps the channel out. I really appreciate it. Thank you, and I will see you in the next video.